Hey guys, so here we go with the first video for chapter 33, where we're going to be talking about the developing world. Now, the term developing world is a relatively new term, and it's used to describe regions of the world that are still in the developing stages when compared to wealthier, more powerful nations such as the United States. Let's first take a closer look at what the word developing means. Now, when I was a student, the term developing world didn't exist. The developing world we used to call the third world. All right, third world is considered to be a somewhat politically incorrect word today, but it referred to nations that were poorer, had lower life expectancies, were more likely to have internal violence, unstable governments, etc., things like that. Now, some trends that we see in the developing world is that these nations are predominantly in the southern hemisphere. All right, if the equator goes roughly right about through here, I know it's a little uneven, but still, I know the equator goes through here. Not exactly, but you guys get the idea. You notice how the regions around it, okay, we're talking about Southeast Asia, we're talking about some scattered spots in Latin America, and we're talking especially Africa. The lighter the shade, the poorer the country. Okay, countries like the United States, Europe, Japan, okay, even some down in the southern area like Argentina, Australia, those are wealthier countries. But as you get more in the, around the equator, it tends to get poorer. Okay, and definitely everything, kind of south of the Tropic of Cancer, which would be just to the north, kind of run around here somewhere. You can see how accurate my map making skills are. That is where you find almost the entire developing world. Okay, so another characteristic is that they were, for the most part, former colonies of the industrialized world. All right, the industrialized world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they went out and they conquered large parts of the world. So like European countries in particular, they conquered Africa, India, Southeast Asia, places like that. And after these countries gained their independence after World War II, we talked about how a lot of these, especially in Africa, they struggled to achieve any level of economic success. Now, a few reasons for this, or at least one reason, is that they still run predominantly on traditional economies. Traditional economies are underdeveloped economies. They are systems that rely on custom and tradition, right? Essentially, it's agriculture and craftsmanship that is the same as it was practiced for many, many generations. Now, because of these traditional economies, many developing nations end up relying on wealthier countries in order to get by. When these nations became independent, they very often were not properly equipped to be self-sufficient, and it resulted in them having to depend on these wealthier nations. Now, we'll talk more about this in a bit. An important change in the developing world took place, though, with this thing called the Green Revolution. Now, the green in the Green Revolution refers to farming, not green like environmentally friendly like we tend to use today. Starting in the 1950s and 60s, better farming methods were introduced, such as pesticides. Let me move me out of the way here. So you have pesticides, spray for bugs, fertilizers, machines, okay, better technology. These are introduced into the developing world. The overall impact was that it raised farm outputs and crop production. Now you think, okay, this sounds like a good thing, right? You're increasing production. And it was, but it was only for a select few. You see, only the wealthier landowners could afford the technology, like the harvesters and the pesticides and so forth. And because of this, they saw the vast majority of the profits. They ended up buying up most of the land, and it ended up driving small farmers out of business. So despite having some lofty goals for development, many of these new nations struggled to make any real progress when it came to agriculture and farm output. Let's talk about some obstacles to development that a lot of these nations experience. One is rapidly rising populations. Let's look at the graph here. Let me move me completely out of the way so you can see it fully. All right, so in the year 1900, you can see that there's not a big difference in terms of the population of developing countries and the developed countries. You see how by the 1950s, in the post-World War II years, it starts to rapidly go up. And then by the late 20th century, early 21st century, okay, it is getting way, way more than what we see in the developed countries. And you see how it's going to expand into the end of the 21st century as well. Now, this is largely due to improved healthcare provided by organizations like the United Nations and an increased food supply thanks to developments like the Green Revolution. But this fast growth population has negative consequences. These people need food. housing, healthcare, things like that. There aren't enough resources, and the governments of these countries can't afford the services. As a consequence of this, millions of people in the developing world become stuck in a cycle of poverty. Right? And we're talking about crushing poverty. All right? There's poverty in the United States, and then there's third world poverty. All right? It's living in absolute destitution, not knowing where your food is going to come from one day to the next. It lowers the average life expectancy, and without education, these countries aren't able to provide adequate educational services. It makes it very difficult for people to escape this cycle of poverty. Another obstacle is economic dependence that we talked about just previously. Many developing nations remain economically dependent on their former colonial rulers. Imperialist nations exploited colonies for natural resources and labor. They didn't allow them to develop into self-sufficient economies. That wasn't a priority for them. This didn't really change after colonies gained their independence. Developing nations still to this day have to rely on the industrialized world a lot more than the other way around. And one last obstacle are unstable governments. We discussed this a lot in the chapter on Africa. But civil wars, violent overthrows of governments, they are way too common in the developing world. And these governments also tend to be run by dictators and corrupt leaders. So, even though it has been very uneven, the economic development seen in the developing world has led to some significant changes in life patterns. An example, increase in child labor. In traditional agriculture, children worked alongside adults on the farm. And when development leads to industrialization, families move to the cities looking for work, and very often children end up working in the factories as well. It's the exact same pattern we learned about in Western Europe during the 1800s. In some countries, children make up a significant portion of the workforce. India has almost 50 million children working full-time, many of them on very unsafe conditions, but they work for cheaper, so it's more advantageous for the factory owners to have children working. Another change is the rise in what we call religious fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism calls for a return to what religious leaders see as fundamental or basic values of faith. They can occur in any religion, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, right? You see men only, okay? But it's become very prominent in the Islamic world, all right? No democracy, we just want Islam. And this can be especially dangerous when it can lead to terrorism. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next chapter. One other major change is rapid urbanization. Industrialization and development leads to the growth of cities. Right? Like child labor, this is the same as that we saw in Europe over a century ago. And like in Europe of the 1800s, the working class live in very poor conditions. In the developing world, many city dwellers live in what we call shanty towns. Now, shanty towns are crowded, dangerous slums on the edges of city. And as you can see from the pictures, they often live in homes that are little more than sheds with little to no utilities such as plumbing or electricity. But in some of these slums, such as in India and even some in Africa, you can have millions and millions of people living in them. Okay, so very, very low standard of living that you find in these shanty towns. All right, so that will wrap it up for a basic overview of the developing world. And in the next section, we're going to talk about two countries that kind of go back and forth between the developing and the developed world with China and India.